History remembers what it can explain, but some events refuse to fit, dismissed, buried, or quietly left out of the textbooks because no one could make sense of them. Places disappear without explanation. Records hint at knowledge that shouldn't have existed yet. Signals, sightings, and disasters unfold and then vanish from record, leaving only fragments and unanswered questions behind. These aren't legends whispered in the dark. They're documented, investigated, and still unresolved. Tonight, we open 15 case files that science, historians, and governments have never fully closed. So, sit back, relax, and let's dive in. In the north of England, where the land rises into moor and mist, a stone wall still runs for miles across the countryside. Hadrian's Wall, built in the 2nd century AD to mark the edge of an empire. Beneath its shadow, in the soil of what was once the Roman fortress of Eboracum, archaeologists have spent generations piecing together the story of the men who guarded this frontier. Among them, the 9th Legion, Legionis Hispana, one of Rome's most storied fighting units. And then, sometime in the early 2nd century, they simply stop appearing in the record. The 9th Legion was no obscure outfit. Raised more than a century before, it had fought in Spain, marched with Julius Caesar, and helped conquer Britain itself. Inscriptions bearing its name appear at York as late as 108 AD. After that, nothing. No death notice, no disbanding order, no triumphant return to Rome. Roughly 5,000 men, along with their officers, equipment, and standards, fade from history without a single surviving account of what became of them. The most widely accepted explanation is also the simplest. They were destroyed in Britain, likely during unrest among the northern tribes in the early 2nd century. Some historians point to Emperor Hadrian's decision to build his wall shortly afterward as indirect evidence, a defensive response to a catastrophic loss on the frontier. It's a tidy theory, but it rests almost entirely on absence, not evidence. No mass grave has ever been found, no battlefield has been identified. No Roman writer of the period explicitly says the 9th fell in Britain at all. That gap has left room for other explanations to grow. Some scholars argue the legion wasn't destroyed in Britain at all, but transferred elsewhere in the empire, to the Rhine, or further east, and met its end fighting in a conflict far from the misty hills of York. A fragment of evidence lends this some weight. A tile stamped with the 9th's name, found in the Netherlands, dated to a period after their supposed disappearance from Britain. Does that mean the legion survived and moved on? Or does it simply mean a detachment, not the whole force, was stationed there before the rest met a darker fate at home? The tile answers nothing on its own. It only deepens the question. Then there are the theories that live further outside the mainstream, that the legion was swallowed whole by hostile territory north of the wall, vanishing into land the Romans never fully controlled or documented. That its loss was so humiliating to Roman pride that it was deliberately struck from official memory. These ideas are harder to substantiate, resting more on the shape of the silence than on any physical trace. Historians generally treat them with caution, not dismissal. Reminders of how easily an absence of evidence can be filled with imagination. What makes the case endure isn't spectacle. It's the quiet, procedural nature of the disappearance. A legion that existed in every record, then simply stopped being mentioned, as if the empire itself forgot to finish the sentence. Rome kept meticulous records. Its legions were bureaucratic entities as much as military ones, tracked in pay ledgers and supply chains. For an entire legion to vanish from that system without explanation is, in itself, strange. Somewhere between the wall and the wilderness beyond it, the story of the 9th Legion breaks off. Did they die in battle, in a war time forgot to record? Did they march on, only to be erased by circumstance rather than combat? Or does the truth lie buried still, in ground no one has yet thought to dig? If the story of the Ninth Legion is a mystery of absence, a silence where there should have been record, the mystery that follows is the opposite. It is a mystery written into the sky itself, witnessed by an entire hemisphere, and yet, 16 centuries later, we are still arguing about what caused it. Picture a tree, not a famous one, just an ordinary pine growing in the mountains of Scandinavia, or the high forests of California, or the peat bogs of Ireland. Cut it down, slice through its trunk, and you'll find its life story written in rings, one for every year it stood. Most years the rings are unremarkable, some wider, some narrower, shaped by rainfall and sunlight. But if you count back to the year 536 AD, something changes. The ring for that year, and for several years after, is almost impossibly thin, stunted. In some samples, barely visible at all. Trees on nearly every continent, unaware of each other, unaware of history, all tell the same story. 536 was a year when something went badly wrong with the sun. We don't have to rely on tree rings alone. The written record, thin and scattered as it is for this period, backs them up. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the historian Procopius, an eyewitness chronicler working in the court of the Byzantine Empire, recorded something that reads less like history and more like an omen, that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, for the entirety of a year. Not an eclipse which he would have recognized and dismissed in a sentence. Something stranger, something sustained. Across the world in China, court astronomers recorded a similar phenomenon, a dimming of the sun, a yellow dust that seemed to fall like snow, and, more troubling still, summer frost and failed harvests in a year and region where none should have occurred. In Ireland, ancient annals speak of a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. In Mesoamerica, evidence gathered separately points to drought and hardship in roughly the same window. However you approach it, through wood, through ice, through ink, the world seems to agree that something happened. What it disagrees on is why. The leading explanation, and the one most climate scientists now accept, is volcanic. A massive eruption, or perhaps a rapid series of them, could have thrown enormous quantities of sulfate aerosols into the upper atmosphere, forming a veil fine enough to circle the globe and block enough sunlight to dim the sun itself without eclipsing it. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica, frozen archives that trap and preserve the fallout of ancient eruptions layer by layer, do show a spike in sulfate deposits at almost exactly this time. For years, researchers debated which volcano was responsible. Suspicion fell on Ilopango in modern-day El Salvador, and later on candidates in Iceland or the tropics. Then, more recent ice core work suggested something even stranger. Not one eruption, but two, closely spaced, 536, and then again around 540, compounding the damage, extending the cold, deepening the famine, as though the planet was struck twice before it had any chance to recover. If that were the whole story, it would already be remarkable. A hidden volcanic event, invisible in written history, discovered only through frozen air and stunted wood, quietly reshaping the ancient world. But the deeper researchers dig, the harder the pieces are to fully reconcile. Why does no confirmed eruption of the right size and date, matching the isotopic fingerprint in the ice, have a certain undisputed geological address? Volcanology has narrowed the list of suspects over the decades, but has not closed the case. The very mountain, or mountains, responsible for one of the coldest decades in the last 2,000 years, remains, in a real sense, still unidentified. And then there is the matter of scale. The 536 event did not simply cause a bad harvest and a hard winter. It initiated what climatologists have come to call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of unusually cold temperatures that some evidence suggests lasted well over a century. Tree ring records across Europe and Asia show reduced growth continuing for decades beyond the initial event, as though the planet's climate had been knocked out of balance and struggled to find its footing again. Historians have connected this cold period, cautiously and not without controversy, to some of the most consequential upheavals of the age. Crop failures and famine across Europe and China, the movements of peoples fleeing hardship, and, most strikingly, the arrival of the first recorded outbreak of bubonic plague, the plague of Justinian, which swept through the Byzantine Empire beginning in 541, killing, by some estimates, tens of millions of people. Was the plague's arrival a coincidence of timing, or did a cooling, stressed climate, failed harvests, weakened populations, disrupted trade routes, create the exact conditions in which such a pandemic could take hold and spread with such catastrophic speed? Mainstream historians are divided, and rightly cautious about assigning too much to any single cause. But the timing is difficult to ignore. It's here that the more speculative theories begin to surface, not fringe in the sense of being fantastical, but existing at the edges of an already uncertain field. Some researchers have proposed that the atmospheric dust of 536 wasn't purely volcanic in origin, but partly extraterrestrial, the debris of a comet or fragmenting body passing close to Earth, adding material to the sky through an entirely different mechanism. The evidence for this remains thin and largely circumstantial, built more on the absence of a confirmed eruption than on any positive proof of an impact. Other theories point to the possibility of concurrent, unrelated volcanic events in different parts of the world, compounding each other by coincidence, two separate crises mistaken, through the compressed lens of history, for one. None of these ideas have displaced the volcanic explanation as the leading theory, but none of them have been fully ruled out either, and that, in itself, says something about how much of this event remains genuinely unresolved. What makes 536 different from many entries in this list is that we are not debating whether something happened. The trees do not lie about their own growth. The ice does not lie about what fell into it. Procopius did not imagine a darkened sun, nor did the astronomers of Tang Dynasty China invent summer frost to fill their records. The event is real, global, and extensively documented in the language of the natural world, even where human chroniclers fell silent or left only fragments. What remains hidden is not the fact of the catastrophe, but its exact origin, the single mountain or comet or convergence of causes that a 14-year-old boy in Constantinople and a farmer in rural China would both have looked up and quietly wondered about on the day the sun stopped giving off its warmth. Somewhere, buried under ice that has not yet been drilled, or rock that has not yet been dated, the true source of the darkness of 536 may still be waiting to be found. Until then, we are left with the ring in the tree, the layer in the ice, and the strange, quiet unanimity of a world that all seemed to notice in the same year that something in the sky had gone wrong. Where the 536 event left its evidence in ice cores and tree rings, this next mystery leaves its evidence in stone, in temples that still rise above the jungle canopy, built by a civilization that seemed, by every measure available to us, to be at the height of its power in the very decades before it began, quite deliberately, to fall silent. Deep in the lowlands of what is now Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and southern Mexico, the jungle has spent over 1,000 years trying to reclaim a city called Tikal. Its temples still climb over 200 feet above the forest floor, limestone pyramids built without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, engineered instead through astronomy, mathematics, and an extraordinary command of labor and stone. At its peak, in the 8th century AD, Tikal was home to perhaps 60,000 people, one node in a vast network of Maya city-states that stretched across Central America, linked by trade, rivalry, and a shared written language recorded in glyphs that modern scholars have only fully learned to read within the last few decades. And then, within the span of roughly 100 years, this network of great cities went largely quiet. Construction stopped. Monuments stopped being carved. Populations that had taken centuries to build collapsed by as much as 90% in some regions. The Maya people, of course, never disappeared. Their descendants live across the region today, and their culture persisted and adapted. But the specific, layered civilization of the classic period, the great cities, the divine kings, the dated stone monuments recording their reigns, came to an end. And no single, universally agreed-upon reason explains why. The last carved date at many classic Maya sites falls within a narrow window, clustering around 900 AD, as though a switch had been thrown across an entire civilization within a single lifetime. What makes this collapse different from a slow decline is its speed and its synchronicity. Cities that had stood for centuries, some of them for over 1,000 years, ceased major construction within decades of each other, despite being separated by dense jungle and, in some cases, hundreds of miles. Why would independent city-states with their own kings, their own rivalries, their own local conditions, all falter in roughly the same window of time? The most widely supported explanation today centers on climate. Sediment cores pulled from lake beds across the Yucatan Peninsula, along with cave formations called stalagmites that record centuries of rainfall in their mineral layers, point to a series of severe, prolonged droughts striking the region between approximately 800 and 1000 AD. For a civilization that depended almost entirely on seasonal rainfall to sustain intensive agriculture, with limited rivers and few reliable year-round water sources across much of the lowlands, a sustained drop in rainfall would have been catastrophic. Some studies estimate rainfall reductions of 40 to 50% during the driest intervals, a figure severe enough to collapse food systems that were already under strain from dense populations and heavily worked soil. But drought alone has never fully satisfied researchers because it doesn't explain everything. Why did some cities, even within the same drought-affected region, decline while others nearby persisted for generations longer? Why do some of the most severe collapses appear at cities that, based on their engineering, seem to have had more sophisticated water management, reservoirs, canals, catchment systems, than many that survived? The evidence suggests drought was a trigger, perhaps even the dominant one, but not acting alone. This is where the picture widens, and where mainstream Maya scholarship has moved in recent decades, toward a model of interlocking pressures rather than one clean cause. Population growth had pushed many city-states to the edge of what their land could sustainably support. Deforestation, driven by the enormous demand for wood to build temples, to fuel the fires that produced the lime plaster coating nearly every major structure, appears to have altered local rainfall patterns and worsened soil erosion, compounding the very drought that was already straining the land. And warfare, long underestimated in earlier interpretations of Maya history, appears to have intensified sharply in the final classic centuries. Monuments from this period increasingly record conflict between rival cities, and some sites show evidence of deliberate destruction. Palaces burned, monuments defaced, suggesting that as resources grew scarce, the competition between city-states may have turned from ritualized rivalry into something more desperate and destructive. So the mainstream picture is not a single blow, but a convergence. drought stressing an already overextended system, environmental degradation deepening the drought's effects, and warfare accelerating a collapse already underway. It is, in many ways, a sobering story precisely because it isn't mysterious in the sense of the supernatural. It looks to many researchers uncomfortably like a preview of how complex, resource-strained societies can unravel. And yet the picture remains incomplete. Why this drought, after the Maya had already weathered earlier dry periods across their history? Why did certain cities, like Copan, show signs of political and structural strain decades before the worst of the drought hit, while others held on well past it? The general shape of the collapse is understood. Its precise mechanics, city by city, are not. Beyond the mainstream account, more speculative ideas have circulated, some more grounded than others. A handful of researchers have pointed to the possibility that trade route shifts, as coastal and maritime trade around the Yucatan grew in importance, undermined the economic centrality of inland cities like Tikal, hollowing them out politically even before environmental pressures peaked. Others have raised the question of disease, though direct evidence for a Maya epidemic on the scale of later colonial-era outbreaks remains thin and largely inferential. And on the far edges of speculation, some have wondered whether ideological or religious collapse played a role, whether the failure of the divine kings to control the rains, in a belief system where rulers claimed exactly that power, may have triggered a crisis of political legitimacy as damaging, in its own way, as the drought itself. This idea is compelling as a narrative, but difficult to test archaeologically. It lives more in the realm of interpretation than hard evidence. What remains certain is this: somewhere between the stone glyphs recording the reigns of kings and the silent absence of glyphs recording what came after them, an entire civilizational structure, one of the most sophisticated in the pre-Columbian Americas, came apart within a handful of generations. The temples did not fall. They were simply left, standing empty, for the jungle to slowly grow through. Was it the rain that failed first, or the land, or the rulers who claimed to command both? And how many of the specific decisions, the local failures and local survivals, that decided which cities endured and which fell silent forever, are still waiting in sediment we haven't yet cored or glyphs we haven't yet learned to fully read? Where the Maya left their history carved in stone, the man at the center of this next mystery left almost nothing behind at all. No tomb that has ever been found, no body that has ever been examined, only a wedding night, a sealed tent, and a silence the next morning that would ripple across the ruins of an empire. By the year 453 AD, Attila had spent nearly 2 decades as the single most feared man in Europe. As king of the Huns, he had built and commanded a nomadic empire stretching from the steppes of Central Asia to the borders of Gaul, extracting tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire through a sheer threat of invasion, and personally leading campaigns that devastated cities across the Balkans, Gaul, and northern Italy. Roman writers who had every reason to despise him, nonetheless described him with a kind of reluctant awe, a leader of ferocious discipline, shrewd diplomacy, and a presence that seems, even through the hostile lens of his enemies' chronicles, to have genuinely unsettled those who met him. He was, by the mid-5th century, arguably the most powerful individual in the Western world. And then, in a single night, in a matter of hours, he was gone. The circumstances, as recorded by the Roman historian Priscus, who had, remarkably, met Attila in person years earlier during a diplomatic mission, making his account one of the closest we have to a first-hand source, are almost domestic in their ordinariness, which is precisely what makes them strange. Attila had taken a new wife, a young woman named Ildiko, and the wedding feast, by all accounts, had been lavish. marked by the kind of heavy drinking typical of Hunnic celebration. Attila retired to his private tent with his bride. The next morning, his attendants, growing concerned by the unusual silence, broke into the tent to check on him. They found Attila dead and Ildiko beside him, weeping, apparently unharmed. According to the account preserved by the later historian Jordanes, who drew on Priscus's now largely lost original work, there was no wound on the body, no sign of violence. Instead, the account describes a massive hemorrhage, blood that had flowed seemingly from the nose and pooled inside his throat as he lay on his back, ultimately drowning him in his own blood as he slept, too intoxicated from the feast to wake or call for help. It is, on its surface, an almost anticlimactic ending for a man remembered by history as the Scourge of God, a nickname bestowed, tellingly, by his enemies. No battle, no poison discovered in a cup, no assassin's blade. Just a nosebleed, a wedding night, and silence. And that is precisely why, for over 15 centuries, historians have continued to ask whether the official story is the whole story. The mainstream explanation, and the one most consistent with the earliest surviving account, is medical. That Attila suffered a severe internal hemorrhage, possibly triggered or worsened by acute alcohol consumption, and choked on his own blood in his sleep. Modern physicians examining the ancient description have proposed several plausible mechanisms. A ruptured esophageal varix, a condition sometimes linked to chronic heavy drinking and liver strain, in which fragile blood vessels in the esophagus tear and bleed catastrophically. Or a severe, uncontrolled nosebleed in a man lying flat on his back, unconscious enough from drink not to wake and clear his own airway. Neither diagnosis requires a conspiracy. Neither requires an enemy at all. It requires only bad luck, a body already under strain, and circumstances that turned a night of celebration into a death sentence. But even the earliest sources hint that not everyone believed this was the whole truth. Some later writers preserved a rival tradition, that Attila did not die from natural causes at all, but was murdered, killed by his own wife on their wedding night, either from personal motive or, in some more elaborate versions of the story, as an act of political vengeance carried out on behalf of a rival power. The idea has never been verified, and modern historians treat it with real caution. The murderous bride narrative bears more than a passing resemblance to other folkloric death tales from the ancient world, the kind of dramatic embellishment that tends to attach itself to the deaths of feared rulers over generations of retelling. Yet the fact that this alternative account existed at all, recorded by writers working not so many generations after the events themselves, tells us something. That even close to the source there was doubt. And doubt, in Attila's case, is not unreasonable. Consider the timing. Attila died at what may have been the very peak of his power, poised, by some accounts, to renew his campaign against the Eastern Roman Empire after a temporary setback in Gaul and Italy. His death was, in the most literal sense, extraordinarily convenient for an empire that had spent years paying him tribute simply to stay away. Rome, at this point in its slow decline, had every motive imaginable to want him gone, and a documented history of using assassination, bribery, and covert influence against threats it could not defeat by force. No direct evidence has ever tied Rome to his death. But the absence of evidence in a period so poorly documented and so thoroughly filtered through hostile Roman chroniclers is not the same as evidence of innocence. There is a further complication, one almost mundane in comparison, but no less unresolved. We do not know with certainty where Attila's body was ultimately laid to rest. Ancient sources describe an elaborate funeral, in which Attila was buried inside 3 nested coffins, one of gold, one of silver, one of iron, symbolizing dominion he had held in life. To keep the site hidden from grave robbers and enemies alike, The workers who dug his tomb were, according to the same accounts, executed immediately afterward, taking the exact location with them into their own graves. No burial site attributed to Attila has ever been confirmed by archaeologists, despite periodic claims and searches across the regions once controlled by the Huns, largely centered on the Hungarian plain. Without a body, there can be no forensic examination, no modern toxicology, no re-examination of bone or tissue that might finally settle one way or the other, whether disease, drink, or design ended his life. What remains, then, is a death almost defiantly ordinary in its telling, attached to a man whose life was anything but a conqueror who could summon armies capable of shaking an empire, undone, by every surviving account, in the quiet of his own tent. Was it truly his body that failed him, worn down by the same excess that marked his celebrations? Or did someone, reach him in a way no army ever could? And somewhere beneath the plains of Hungary, sealed inside iron, silver, and gold, does the tomb of Attila the Hun still wait to be found, holding whatever answer his own century chose to bury with him? A river does not usually keep secrets on purpose. But in the south of Italy, in the early autumn of 410 AD, one river was made to keep the greatest secret of its age, and it has never once given it up. The river is the Busento, a modest waterway running through the town of Cosenza in the region of Calabria, at the southern tip of the Italian peninsula. It is not, on the surface, a place that suggests grandeur. But it was here, according to a tradition recorded by later chroniclers, that the Visigothic king Alaric was laid to rest, in a burial so deliberate, so elaborate, and so thoroughly hidden that no trace of it has ever been recovered. Despite 16 centuries of searching, and despite the fact that the man buried there had, only weeks earlier, achieved something no barbarian leader had managed in 800 years. In August of 410, Alaric and his Visigothic forces breached the walls of Rome and sacked the city, the first time Rome itself had fallen to a foreign army since the Gauls, nearly 8 centuries before. To the Roman world, the psychological impact was almost impossible to overstate. Rome was not merely a city, it was the idea of permanence itself, and its fall sent shockwaves through the empire that St. Augustine, writing shortly afterward, felt compelled to address directly, defending the faith against those who saw the sack as proof the old gods, or perhaps any gods, had abandoned the city. Alaric, having achieved what may have been the defining act of his life, did not linger to rule the city he'd conquered. He turned south, apparently intending to lead his people across the narrow strait to Sicily and onward into North Africa, perhaps in search of the grain supplies that fed Rome and might now sustain his own people. He never made it. Somewhere near Cosenza, Alaric died. Of illness, according to every surviving account, though the sources are frustratingly thin on specifics, offering no detail of symptoms, no timeline, nothing beyond the simple fact of a sudden death in the midst of a campaign that had, until that moment, seemed unstoppable. It is what happened next that has fascinated historians for centuries. According to the account preserved by the 6th century historian Jordanus, writing roughly 100 years after the events themselves, drawing on earlier, now lost sources, Alaric's grieving people made a decision as audacious as anything he had accomplished in life. They diverted the course of the Busento River, temporarily rerouting its waters through forced labor, and buried their king in the exposed riverbed, along with a substantial portion of the treasure his forces had taken from Rome itself: gold, silver, and looted riches from the wealthiest city in the Western world. Once the burial was complete, the river was released back into its original channel, flowing once more over the grave, concealing it beneath moving water where no grave robber could ever dig. And then, in the account's final and most chilling detail, the enslaved laborers who had carried out the work were killed immediately afterward, ensuring that no one who knew the tomb's exact location would live to reveal it, or return to loot it themselves. If true, it is one of the most extraordinary funerary efforts recorded from the ancient world, a river itself repurposed as a vault, sealing away not just a king, but an almost unimaginable fortune indefinitely. And unlike the vague, largely undiscoverable burial described for Attila decades later on the plains of Hungary, Alaric's tomb comes with something rare in ancient mysteries, a specific geographic anchor. We know, roughly, where the Busento flows. We know Cosenza's location has not changed in any dramatic way in 1600 years. The tomb, if it exists as described, should be findable, at least in theory, somewhere along a limited stretch of riverbed. And yet, despite that specificity, it has never been found. Searches for Alaric's tomb date back centuries, intensifying periodically whenever new technology or fresh enthusiasm renewed interest in the story. Antiquarians dug along the Busento's banks as early as the Renaissance. In the 20th century and again in recent years, teams have used ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical survey methods to scan beneath the riverbed and surrounding terrain, hoping to detect the outline of a chamber, a disturbance in the soil, anything that might mark an artificial burial beneath the water's natural course. As of now, no confirmed tomb, no treasure, and no human remains conclusively tied to Alaric have ever been recovered. The Busento continues to flow exactly as it has for centuries, indifferent to everyone who has stood on its banks wondering what lies beneath it. Mainstream historians generally accept the broad outline of the Jourdain's account as plausible, even if some details may have been embellished or simplified over a century of retelling before he wrote them down. Diverting a river for a burial, while extraordinary, was not entirely without precedent or capability for a large, organized force with access to forced labor, and the underlying motive, protecting both a beloved king's remains and an enormous quantity of looted wealth from a hostile Roman population still reeling from the sack of their capital, is coherent and consistent with the political reality the Visigoths faced. Rome had fallen once. Its emperors and remaining forces would have had every reason to want that treasure back, and every incentive to violate any ordinary grave to get it. Still, the absence of physical confirmation after so many centuries of searching has left room for more speculative questions. Did the burial happen exactly as described, or has the true site simply eroded, shifted, or been built over by a town that has occupied the same ground continuously since antiquity? Modern Cosenza sits directly atop much of the likely search area, meaning any tomb could now lie beneath centuries of urban construction rather than open riverbank, effectively placing it out of reach of most conventional survey methods. Others have questioned whether the treasure described by Jordanes was ever buried with Alaric at all, or whether it was redirected elsewhere by his successor, and the story of the river burial grew, over generations of retelling, into something more symbolic than literal, a legend of a king's dignity preserved, whether or not it reflects the precise mechanics of what was actually done that autumn. What remains is a river that has kept its secret for over 1,600 years, flowing through the same Italian town, past the same hills, entirely unconcerned with the questions asked on its banks. Did the Visigoths truly reroute an entire river to hide their king? Or has the story itself grown, like the water, into something larger and less precise than the reality it describes? And if the tomb is real, if it survived intact beneath Cosenza all this time, what does it mean that a fortune looted from the greatest city in the Western world may still be resting, undisturbed, only a few meters beneath a riverbed people cross every day without a second thought? High in the mountains of the Swiss Alps, glaciers move slowly enough that a human lifetime is rarely long enough to notice much change at all. And yet, locked within their ice, layer upon layer of compressed snow, each one a record of a single year's weather, is a record far more precise than anything the survivors of late antiquity ever managed to write down. When climate scientists began reading that record carefully in recent decades, drilling cores from alpine glaciers and cross-referencing them against similar cores pulled from Greenland and the Alps of Central Asia, they found something that written history had only ever hinted at. A cooling event so severe, so prolonged, and so global that some researchers now consider it the coldest period in the last 2,000 years. Colder, by some measures, than the more famous Little Ice Age that would grip Europe centuries later. It has come to be called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, and while we have already traced its opening act, the darkened sun and stunted trees of 36, the deeper question, the one that continues to divide specialists, is what sustained it, and why it struck with the severity and the staying power that it did. The basic timeline is, by now, well established. The initial shock arrived around 536, followed by a second major eruption event around 540, each pumping sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere and dimming the sun across the northern hemisphere. On its own, this kind of volcanic winter typically fades within a handful of years, as the aerosols settle out of the atmosphere and sunlight returns to something close to normal. This time, it didn't. Tree ring records from Siberia, Scandinavia, and the Austrian Alps show suppressed growth continuing not for 2 or 3 years, but in some analyses for over a century, with the coldest decade of the entire 2,000-year tree ring record falling in the 540s. Glaciers across the Alps and elsewhere began to advance, swallowing pastures and mountain passes that had been in use for generations. Something had pushed the climate system past a temporary shock and into a prolonged, self-sustaining cold period. And that something is where consensus starts to fracture. The leading explanation involves a feedback loop, one that doesn't require any single, sustained cause beyond the initial volcanic trigger. According to this model, the first eruptions cooled the northern hemisphere enough to expand sea ice across the North Atlantic and Arctic. Once formed, that additional sea ice reflected more sunlight back into space, reinforcing the cooling rather than allowing the system to recover. Expanded sea ice can also disrupt ocean circulation patterns, potentially weakening the currents that normally carry warmth northward from the tropics, further entrenching the cold. In this model, the volcanoes didn't need to keep erupting to keep the world cold. They only needed to push the climate system hard enough, at a vulnerable enough moment, to trigger a chain reaction that the system then sustained on its own for a century or more. It is an elegant explanation, and one supported by ice core and marine sediment evidence showing expanded Arctic sea ice extent through the mid-500s. But elegance is not the same as certainty, and several pieces of the picture remain difficult to fully pin down. One of the central open questions is simply how many eruptions were actually involved, and how large each one truly was. Ice core sulfate records show at least 2, and possibly 3, major volcanic signals clustered within a few years of each other in the 530s and 540s, but matching those chemical signatures to specific, confirmed volcanoes on the ground has proven extraordinarily difficult. Without a confirmed eruption site and confirmed eruption size for each event, researchers are forced to estimate atmospheric impact indirectly, through models, rather than measuring it directly, which leaves real uncertainty in exactly how severe the initial trigger was and whether volcanic activity alone can fully account for a cooling event of this duration. There is also the matter of solar activity, a factor some researchers argue has been underweighted in the volcanic-focused narrative. Independent proxy records, derived from isotopes preserved in ice cores that reflect changes in cosmic ray activity, itself linked to the sun's magnetic behavior, suggest the sun may have entered a period of reduced activity during roughly the same centuries as the late antique Little Ice Age. A quieter sun, producing marginally less energy over an extended period, could have compounded volcanic cooling, making it harder for the climate system to recover between shocks or contributing independently to the prolonged chill. The evidence here is genuinely contested. Solar variability of this kind is difficult to measure precisely for any period before direct instrumental records began, and estimating its magnitude for the 6th century requires layers of indirect inference that many climate scientists treat with appropriate caution. It may have been a meaningful contributing factor. It may have been a minor one. The proxy record at present cannot fully settle the question either way. Beyond the mainstream volcanic and feedback loop model, more speculative frameworks have occasionally been raised, generally with far less supporting evidence. Some have wondered whether an unusually active period of volcanism worldwide, not just the 2 or 3 major signals identified in the ice cores, but a broader cluster of smaller eruptions across multiple regions, collectively suppressed global temperatures in a way that no single eruption record fully captures. Others have pointed to the disruption of Eurasian trade and agriculture during this period as evidence of compounding, cascading effects, deforestation from population displacement, changes in land use following plague and famine, altering local and regional climates in ways that layered atop the primary cooling trend. These remain harder to test directly against the physical record, existing more as open hypotheses than established science. What can be said with confidence is this: for roughly a century, and in some measures considerably longer, the Northern Hemisphere grew and stayed measurably colder than at almost any other point in the last 2 millennia, and the world's societies, Byzantine, Chinese, Scandinavian, Mesoamerican, absorbed the consequences in famine, plague, and upheaval whose full scale is still being reconstructed. The trigger we largely understand. The mechanism that sustained it for so long, and every volcano and variable that contributed to its severity, remains only partly resolved. Was it truly a single feedback loop set in motion by 2 or 3 eruptions and then left to run its course? Or were there forces at work, in the sun, in the oceans, in the slow accumulation of smaller, unrecorded events that historians and climate scientists have not yet fully accounted for? Somewhere in the deep ice of Greenland and the high glaciers of the Alps, more of that answer may still be waiting, layer by layer, to be read. In 1992, in China's Zhejiang province, a group of villagers pumping water out of what they'd always assumed were bottomless ponds made a discovery that no historical record had prepared them for. As the water level dropped, it revealed not a natural sinkhole but a vast cavernous chamber, carved unmistakably by human hands. Over the following years, as more ponds in the area were drained, the number of chambers grew to at least 24, hidden beneath the village of Longyou for who knows how many centuries, known to no living resident, referenced in no surviving local chronicle, and entirely absent from the written record of a region with a documented history stretching back over 2,000 years. The scale of what was found is difficult to overstate. Each cavern is enormous, some extending over 100 feet in length and reaching ceiling heights of comparable size, with support pillars left standing at deliberate intervals, carved from the same bedrock rather than assembled separately to hold the chamber roofs in place. The walls and ceilings are covered, floor to ceiling, in a uniform pattern of parallel chisel marks, evenly spaced and consistently angled, suggesting careful, coordinated labor rather than haphazard digging. Engineers who have studied the site have estimated that removing this much stone by hand, using the tools available in ancient China, would have required an immense and sustained labor force working over what was likely a period of years, if not decades. And yet, for a construction project of this magnitude, one that would have consumed enormous resources, organized enormous numbers of workers, and reshaped the landscape beneath an entire region, there is no reference to it anywhere. Not in local gazetters, not in imperial records, not in the oral traditions of the villages that, unknowingly, had been living above the caverns for generations before they were rediscovered. That absence is, in many ways, the central mystery. Ancient China kept meticulous records, particularly for large, state-sponsored construction projects, canals, walls, tombs, palaces. A labor undertaking of this scale, involving the removal of an estimated 1 million cubic meters of rock, according to some published estimates, is exactly the kind of project one would expect to appear somewhere in the historical record, whether as an achievement to be celebrated or a burden to be complained about in surviving tax and labor documents. Instead, nothing. No inscriptions have been found within the caves identifying who built them, when, or why. No tools have been recovered from the site that would allow for direct dating. Archaeologists have been left to estimate the age of the caverns largely through indirect methods, comparing the tool marks to techniques known from other regional sites, and analyzing sediment and mineral deposits within the caves, with most current estimates placing their construction sometime prior to 212 BC, during the pre-Qin dynasty era, making them, if accurate, well over 2,000 years old. But even that estimate carries real uncertainty, and researchers are candid that a more precise date has not been firmly established. The most straightforward explanation, and the one most researchers favor, is that the caverns were quarries, sites where stone was systematically extracted for use in construction elsewhere in the region, whether for building foundations, city walls, or other large-scale projects. This explanation has genuine merit. The uniform chisel marks are consistent with organized quarrying work, and the careful placement of supporting pillars suggests builders who understood, at a sophisticated level, how to remove large volumes of rock while keeping the resulting chamber structurally sound over an extended period. Ancient Chinese engineers were, by this era, already capable of remarkable feats of construction and hydraulic engineering, and quarrying stone from underground rather than through open surface excavation would have offered some practical advantages, potentially protecting the extraction site from weather and preserving usable farmland on the surface above. And yet, the quarry explanation, while plausible, doesn't fully satisfy everyone who has studied the site closely. If these were simply utilitarian quarries, why does the craftsmanship inside them go so far beyond what pure function would require? The chisel marks are not merely functional gouges, they form a consistent, almost decorative pattern across every wall and ceiling, repeated with a level of visual uniformity that seems to exceed what would be strictly necessary for stone extraction alone. Why invest that level of aesthetic consistency across 24 separate chambers in a space that, if it was purely a quarry, no one beyond the laborers themselves was ever likely to see? Some researchers have suggested the caverns may have served a dual purpose, functioning as a quarry while also being constructed with enough care and formality to serve a secondary role, perhaps as storage chambers, military shelters, or even spaces with some ceremonial or symbolic function, though direct evidence for any of these secondary uses remains circumstantial rather than conclusive. Beyond these more grounded theories, the cavern's mysterious rediscovery and lack of documentation have understandably invited more speculative interpretations. Some have proposed the caves may have served a specifically military purpose, as hidden shelters, supply depots, or staging grounds for troop movements during one of the many periods of regional conflict in China's long history. Deliberately built underground and left undocumented precisely because their strategic value depended on secrecy. It's a theory consistent with the cavern's careful concealment, but one that remains difficult to confirm without any surviving military record referencing them. Further out, at the edges of speculation, a small number of researchers and enthusiasts have questioned whether the tools, and techniques available in the estimated construction period were truly sufficient to explain both the scale and precision of the site, given how conclusively the surviving record is otherwise silent on the endeavor. Mainstream archaeologists remain confident that the technology and labor systems of the era were fully capable of this kind of undertaking, pointing to comparable large-scale quarrying and engineering projects from the same broad period elsewhere in China. But the near-total absence of corroborating record for a project this size continues to leave an unusually wide gap between what was clearly accomplished and what we can actually document about who accomplished it and why. What remains, more than 3 decades after those first villagers pumped the water from their ponds, is a site that raises more questions the more closely it is studied. 24 chambers, methodically carved with a consistency that speaks to skill, patience, and organization on a massive scale, and not one surviving word from the people who built them, explaining what any of it was for. Was this simply the largest quarry of its era, its purpose lost only because no one thought it worth writing down? Or does the deliberate uniformity carved into every wall suggest an intention beyond simple stone extraction? A purpose still waiting to be understood? And if a labor project of this magnitude could vanish so completely from written memory, hidden beneath ordinary villages for 2,000 years, what else might still be sitting beneath our feet, simply waiting for someone to drain the water and look? Some mysteries are hidden underground, waiting for the water to drain before they can be seen. Others were never buried at all. They were carried away in the arms of the men who defeated their bearers and simply walked out of history in front of everyone. In the collection of the Vatican museums and in a handful of other institutions across Europe, visitors can view small bronze and gold figures of eagles, the standardized emblem or aquila that once sat atop a pole carried at the head of every Roman legion. These weren't decorative flourishes. To a Roman soldier, the eagle was the physical embodiment of the legion itself, a sacred object kept in a shrine within camp, guarded around the clock, and treated with a reverence that bordered on religious devotion. Losing your eagle to the enemy wasn't simply a battlefield defeat. It was, in the eyes of Rome, closer to a spiritual catastrophe, an event so shameful that the legion which lost it could be disbanded entirely. Its number retired from the army rolls as though the unit itself had ceased to have the right to exist. Across nearly 1,000 years of Roman military history, we know of a number of eagles that were captured by enemy forces. Rome, characteristically, made enormous efforts to recover them, sometimes waiting generations and mounting entire campaigns for the singular purpose of reclaiming a lost standard. And yet, despite that determination, despite the meticulous record-keeping the empire is famous for, several of these eagles were never recovered at all. And to this day, no one knows, with any certainty, what ultimately became of them. The most famous case, and the one that best illustrates both the scale of the loss and the lengths Rome would go to reverse it, comes from 9 AD in the dense forests of Germania. 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus, were marching through unfamiliar territory when they were ambushed by an alliance of Germanic tribes led by Arminius, a chieftain who had, in one of history's more bitter ironies, been trained as a Roman officer himself. Over 3 days of fighting through forest and marsh, all 3 legions were effectively destroyed. A loss so severe, involving as many as 20,000 Roman soldiers, that the Emperor Augustus, according to the historian Suetonius, was said to have wandered his palace afterward, striking his head against the door frames, crying out for Varus to give him back his legions. All 3 eagles were lost to the Germanic tribes in the disaster. Rome's response was determined and sustained. Over the following years, Roman commanders led repeated punitive campaigns back into Germanic territory, driven as much by the desire to reclaim the standards as by any strategic objective. The eagle of the 19th Legion was recovered in 15 AD by the general Germanicus, found among the possessions of a defeated tribe. The eagle of the 17th was recovered the following year in a separate engagement. But the eagle of the 18th Legion, the third and final standard lost that day in the forest, was never found. Roman forces continued campaigning in the region for years afterward, and while ancient sources describe the recovery of the other two standards in some detail, the fate of the third eagle simply disappears from the historical record. Did it end up divided among tribes who scattered before Rome's forces returned? Was it melted down for its gold, its symbolic value meaningless to the people who had captured it? Or does it remain, even now, buried somewhere in the soil of what is today northern Germany, waiting for the kind of chance discovery that revealed the Teutoburg battlefield itself only in the 1980s, after nearly 2,000 years of the site's exact location being lost? A second, equally striking case comes from further south and east, in 53 BC, at the Battle of Karhay, in what is now southeastern Turkey, near the border with Syria. There, the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man whose wealth was legendary even in his own lifetime, and whose political ambitions had driven him to seek the kind of military glory that had already made his rivals Caesar and Pompey famous, led 7 legions against the Parthian Empire, seeking to expand Rome's reach into a region no Roman army had successfully conquered before. The campaign ended in catastrophe. Parthian cavalry, employing devastating mounted archery tactics that Roman infantry formations struggled to counter in the open terrain, annihilated Crassus's army. Crassus himself was killed, and Roman accounts, admittedly colored by hostility toward the enemy, claimed the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat afterward, a symbolic mockery of the greed that had driven him to the campaign in the first place. In the chaos of the defeat, multiple legionary eagles fell into Parthian hands. Accounts suggest as many as 7 standards may have been lost, representing one of the most complete losses of Roman military insignia recorded in a single engagement. This time, the recovery took far longer and came through diplomacy rather than conquest. It wasn't until 20 BC, 33 years after the battle, that the Emperor Augustus, through a combination of military pressure and negotiated settlement, secured the return of the captured standards from the Parthian king. The event was treated as a major propaganda triumph, commemorated on coins and in official art, most famously on the breastplate of the Augustus of Prima Porta statue, which depicts a Parthian figure handing a standard back to a personified Rome. And yet, even here, in what is remembered as a genuine diplomatic success, historical accounts are not entirely consistent on whether every single eagle lost at Karhay was actually returned, or whether the negotiated settlement quietly left some standards unaccounted for, absorbed into Parthian temples or treasuries, and never mentioned again once Rome had declared the matter closed. These are the 2 best documented cases, but they are not the only ones. Scattered throughout the historical record are references to other eagles lost during Rome's long military history, during the chaotic civil wars of the 1st century BC, during frontier conflicts along the Rhine and Danube in the Imperial period, and during the empire's slow military contraction in its final centuries. Most of these references are frustratingly brief, often a single line in a surviving text noting that a standard was lost, with no further detail on whether or how it was ever reclaimed. This pattern of incomplete record-keeping raises an uncomfortable question for anyone trying to reconstruct the full picture. How many eagles were lost across the full span of Roman military history that we simply have no record of at all, either because the defeat itself went unrecorded by chroniclers eager to protect Rome's reputation, or because the relevant texts describing them, like so much of ancient literature, simply did not survive the intervening centuries. The mainstream explanation for why so few of these objects have ever been physically recovered by archaeologists is, in some ways, straightforward, even if unsatisfying. The eagles were made of valuable materials, bronze, and in many cases gilded with gold. And to any people who captured one, whether Germanic tribes or the Parthian court, the standard symbolic value to Rome would have meant little compared to its practical value as metal. Melting captured eagles down, whether to erase a hated symbol of Roman dominance or simply to convert them into currency and other useful items, would have been the most likely fate for the majority of these objects, and would explain why so few have ever surfaced archaeologically despite centuries of searching across former battle sites. This explanation requires no hidden conspiracy and no undiscovered hoard. It requires only the practical calculations of ancient economies, in which a defeated enemy's sacred emblem was, in purely material terms, simply a chunk of valuable metal to be repurposed. Still, that explanation hasn't stopped speculation, particularly around cases like the missing eagle of the 18th Legion, where the scale of the historical stakes seems to call for a more complete resolution than the record provides. Some researchers and enthusiasts have proposed that certain eagles, rather than being melted down, may have been kept intact as trophies or ritual objects by the tribes who captured them, potentially buried with a chieftain or placed in a sacred site in a manner consistent with other significant Iron Age burial practices in Germanic Europe. A theory that, if true, would mean the missing eagle isn't lost in the sense of destroyed, but simply undiscovered, waiting in ground that metal detection and archaeological survey have not yet reached. The rediscovery of the Teutoburg battlefield itself in the 1980s, after being effectively lost for nearly 2,000 years, and the recovery there of thousands of Roman military artifacts including coins, weapons, and equipment fragments, lends this theory at least plausible weight. If an entire battlefield could remain hidden for 2 millennia, a single object, deliberately concealed by people with every reason to keep it that way, is far from an unreasonable possibility. What remains certain is this: for a civilization that prized its military symbols with an intensity that led it to disband entire legions over their loss, and that mounted sustained, sometimes decades-long campaigns for their recovery, Rome was ultimately unable to reclaim every eagle taken from it. Some were returned through conquest, some through negotiation, commemorated afterward in stone and on coins as triumphs worth remembering for centuries. Others simply vanished from the record, their fate left to the same silence that swallowed the 18th Legion standard somewhere in the German forests, or perhaps some of the eagles lost at Carhi, quietly left out of the official account of a diplomatic victory. Were these forgotten eagles melted down within months of their capture, indistinguishable now from any other ancient bronze? Or does at least one of them still rest somewhere, intact in ground that has not yet been searched, or a museum collection somewhere in the world that has never recognized what it actually holds? For an empire that documented so much of its own history in exhaustive detail, the fate of some of its most sacred objects remains, even now, entirely unknown. In the Basilica of Sant'Ambrogio in Milan, behind an altar that has stood for over 1,000 years, there rests a sarcophagus long associated with a man whose life ended not on a battlefield, but on his knees, inside a church, at the order of the empire he had spent decades trying to save. His name was Flavius Stilicho, and for nearly 13 years, he controlled more wealth, more military authority, and more effective power than almost anyone else alive in the Western Roman Empire. When that power collapsed in the summer of 408 AD, it collapsed with a speed that left even his contemporaries struggling to explain it, and left behind a question that historians have never fully resolved. What actually happened to the resources, the funds, and the treasure that had passed through his hands during the years he effectively ran Rome? Stilicho's rise was itself unusual. Born to a Vandal father who had served as a Roman cavalry officer, he was, by ancestry, an outsider to the Roman aristocracy in a way that made his eventual position all the more remarkable. He married Serena, the niece and adopted daughter of the Emperor Theodosius III, and by the time of Theodosius's death in 395, Stilicho had positioned himself as guardian and effective regent for the emperor's young son, Honorius, who inherited the Western Empire as a child barely into his teens. For the next 13 years, Stilicho was, in every practical sense, the Western Roman Empire, commanding its armies, negotiating its treaties, and controlling access to its treasury, all while the nominal emperor remained a largely ceremonial figure. It was Stilicho who managed Rome's increasingly fraught relationship with Alaric and the Visigoths during this period, at times fighting them, and at other times, controversially, negotiating payments and subsidies to keep them from Roman territory, a policy that made military and financial sense to some, and looked to his enemies at court uncomfortably close to appeasement, or worse, collusion. It's this financial relationship with Alaric, the same Alaric whose fate we've already traced to a hidden grave beneath the Bucento, that sits at the center of the mystery. As the official controlling the Western Empire's treasury for over a decade, Stilicho was responsible for enormous sums of state revenue, collected through taxation across the Western provinces, and dispersed for the army's pay, for diplomatic subsidies, and for the general operation of an empire under mounting strain. Roman sources from the period, including the historian Zosimus writing decades later, describe repeated payments made to Alaric's forces during years when the Visigoths were technically at peace with Rome, framed publicly as compensation for military service Alaric's forces had rendered, but viewed with growing suspicion by a Roman Senate and court that increasingly saw Stilicho's dealings with a barbarian king as either dangerously naive or deliberately treacherous. Exactly how large these payments were, and how they were accounted for within the broader machinery of imperial finance, is not fully documented in any surviving source. We know payments were made. We do not have a complete ledger of them. In 408, that suspicion finally caught up with him. With Emperor Honorius's court in Ravenna increasingly hostile to his influence, and rival officials whispering that Stilicho intended to install his own son, Eucharius, as emperor in the east, the situation collapsed with brutal speed. Roman troops, incited by officials opposed to Stilicho, turned on Germanic soldiers serving in Roman ranks across Italy, triggering a wave of violence that fatally undermined his military support. Stilicho, informed of the danger, took refuge in a church in Ravenna, where he was assured safety by an oath, an assurance that turned out to be false. He was arrested and executed on the 22nd of August, 408, on charges that included treason and conspiracy with the very Gothic king he had spent over a decade both fighting and negotiating with. His son Eucharius was killed shortly afterward, and in the aftermath, his considerable personal property, along with whatever state assets could be directly tied to him, was formally confiscated by imperial order. Here is where the documented record grows genuinely thin, and where the real historical uncertainty begins. Stilicho, over 13 years at the center of Western Roman finance and military logistics, would have had access to and control over an extraordinary volume of wealth. Not merely his personal fortune, considerable as that likely was given his position and marriage into the imperial family, but state funds, military pay reserves, and the substantial sums involved in his diplomatic dealings with Alaric. When his fall came, it came almost overnight, driven by a wave of court intrigue and mob violence rather than a slow, orderly transfer of power. Ancient sources record his personal property being seized. What they do not record, in any detail that survives, is a complete accounting of the broader treasury and diplomatic funds he had overseen, what had been spent, what remained, and where exactly it went in the chaotic weeks surrounding his arrest and execution. This gap has fueled genuine historical debate, distinct from folklore, about several open questions. Some historians have focused on the payments to Alaric themselves, questioning whether the full scale of subsidies Stilicho arranged was ever accurately reported to the Roman Senate at all, given how politically damaging the true figures might have been to a general already under suspicion of favoring the enemy. If some portion of state revenue was being funneled toward Alaric's forces through channels the Senate never fully audited, then the missing wealth in this story isn't a hidden hoard waiting to be dug up, but simply funds that were spent and never properly documented, dissolved into the ordinary, undocumented churn of a crumbling administrative system. This is, by far, the most historically grounded explanation, and it requires no buried chest and no secret vault, only the mundane, and in its own way just as troubling, possibility that an empire's finances, at one of its most critical moments, were simply not being tracked with the rigor its survival depended on. A second, related question concerns Serena, Stilicho's widow. She survived her husband's execution by several years, remaining a figure of continued suspicion at the Roman court, and was ultimately strangled by order of the Roman Senate in 410 during the panic surrounding Alaric's siege of the city, on renewed accusations of secretly conspiring with the Gothic king. Her death raises a pointed, if largely unanswerable, question. If she had continued to hold or have knowledge of resources connected to her husband's former position, financial or otherwise, whatever she knew died with her, in a city about to fall to the very king her family had once negotiated with directly. It is worth being clear about where the evidence actually stands, because this case looks different from some of the more storied mysteries in this list. There is no ancient chronicler describing an elaborate hidden burial, no specific legendary treasure with a name and a known general shape in the way Alaric's grave or the missing Roman eagles have come down to us. What exists instead is a documented gap, a period of enormous financial responsibility, held by a single man at the center of a crumbling empire that ends abruptly in violence, followed by an incomplete official record of what, precisely, was recovered, confiscated, or simply left unaccounted for. Some modern historians treat this gap as unremarkable, a natural consequence of chaotic regime change in a bureaucracy already under severe strain. Others view it as a genuinely open question, worth revisiting as more provincial records, tax documents, and archaeological evidence from the period continue to surface and get properly analyzed. What we're left with, then, is not a treasure map, but something closer to an unresolved audit from 1600 years ago. A man who controlled an empire's resources for over a decade, whose fall came so quickly that the paperwork, in every sense, was never finished. Did the funds Stilicho managed simply dissolve into the ordinary financial disorder of a declining empire, spent on soldiers, subsidies, and a war effort that left no clean trail to follow? Or does some portion of what passed through his hands during those 13 years remain genuinely unaccounted for, its fate as unresolved today as it was in the chaotic weeks after a general knelt in a Ravenna church, promised safety and did not receive it? Where Stilicho's story ends in an incomplete ledger, this next mystery begins with a city that shouldn't exist at all, carved into rock in the middle of a desert that offers no obvious reason for anyone to build there, let alone build something so vast, so wealthy, and so far ahead of its neighbors in engineering sophistication. The city is Petra, in what is now southern Jordan, and even now, having drawn visitors for over 2 centuries since its rediscovery by the West in 1812, it still startles people who see it in person. Its most famous structure, the treasury, is carved directly into a sheer sandstone cliff face, its columns and pediment cut from solid rock rather than built up from cut stone, standing over 100 feet tall at the end of a narrow, winding gorge called the Sick. But the treasury is only the most photographed piece of a city that once housed tens of thousands of people, complete with an intricate water management system of channels, cisterns, and dams, engineered to capture and distribute scarce desert rainfall with a level of precision that still impresses hydraulic engineers today. Petra was the capital of the Nabataean kingdom, a civilization that, for roughly 4 centuries, controlled one of the most lucrative trade networks in the ancient world, and then, within a relatively short span of time, essentially disappeared from history's center stage, leaving behind questions about their origins, their methods, and their downfall that remain only partially answered. The Nabataeans themselves are, in many ways, a puzzle before we even reach the question of their decline. They emerge into the historical record around the 4th century BC as a nomadic Arab people, initially known to Greek sources primarily as a group who fiercely resisted a Hellenistic attempt to seize their territory, and, more specifically, their goods. Within a few generations, this same nomadic people had transformed into the operators of an extraordinarily sophisticated commercial empire, controlling the overland trade routes that carried frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia, spices from India carried through the Red Sea ports, and other luxury goods north toward the Mediterranean world. Their wealth was staggering by ancient standards, and it was built almost entirely on their control of information and infrastructure. Knowledge of where water could reliably be found across hundreds of miles of otherwise impassable desert, and the ability to build and maintain the wells, cisterns, and way stations that made travel through that desert possible at all for anyone else. This was not wealth built on conquest or agriculture in any traditional sense. It was wealth built on being the only people who knew how to survive the journey, and who controlled the routes upon which merchants absolutely depended. For centuries, that arrangement made the Nabataeans essential and correspondingly secure. Rome itself, even as it expanded its influence steadily eastward, initially found it more practical to leave the Nabataean kingdom as a client state rather than absorb it outright. Recognizing that the kingdom's specialized expertise in desert logistics was not easily replaceable through direct annexation. This changed in 106 AD, when the Roman Emperor Trajan formally annexed the Nabataean kingdom, folding it into the empire as the new province of Arabia Petraea, without, as far as the surviving sources indicate, significant military resistance, itself a mildly curious detail, given how fiercely earlier Nabataean rulers had defended their independence in previous centuries. And it is from roughly this point forward that the historical picture becomes genuinely difficult to trace with confidence. Petra did not disappear immediately upon annexation. Archaeological evidence shows continued building activity and habitation well into the Roman and even the subsequent Byzantine period, including the construction of churches within the city as the region Christianized in later centuries. But the extraordinary trade wealth that had defined the Nabataean kingdom at its height went into a slow, then increasingly steep decline, and the precise combination of causes behind that decline remains a matter of genuine scholarly disagreement. Part of the explanation is straightforward and well documented: shifting trade routes. As Roman control over the eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea consolidated, and as direct maritime trade routes to India and southern Arabia via the Red Sea and through Egyptian ports grew more developed and more heavily used, the specific overland desert routes the Nabataeans had spent centuries mastering became progressively less essential. Why pay tolls and rely on desert way stations, however expertly maintained, when goods could increasingly travel by sea in bulk, with less risk and, over time, comparable or lower cost? This kind of gradual infrastructure obsolescence is a well-understood pattern in economic history, and it likely accounts for a substantial portion of Petra's decline as a commercial center. But likely accounts for a substantial portion is doing real work in that sentence, because the timeline doesn't cleanly match in every respect. Maritime trade through the Red Sea had already existed for centuries before the Roman annexation, coexisting with, rather than immediately replacing, the overland Nabataean routes. The acceleration of Petra's specific decline seems to occur somewhat later and more abruptly than a purely gradual maritime shift would predict on its own. This is where a second, more physically dramatic factor enters the picture, and where the mystery deepens rather than resolves. In 363 AD, a massive earthquake struck the region, one of several major seismic events known to have affected the Levant and Arabia across antiquity, and the archaeological damage attributable to this specific quake at Petra is significant. Collapsed structures, damaged water channels, and disrupted infrastructure that the city, by this point already past its commercial peak, appears to have only partially rebuilt. Water management was not incidental to Petra's survival. It was the entire foundation of a city built in a location that, without careful engineering, could not have sustained a large population at all. Damage to that system, compounding an already declining trade economy, would have struck at the very core of what had made the city viable in the first place. Yet even here, the record shows resilience rather than immediate collapse. Petra continued to function as a Byzantine provincial center for centuries after 363, hosting a bishopric and continued construction, complicating any narrative that treats the earthquake as a single decisive blow rather than one compounding stress among several. The final chapter of Petra's decline, and the one that leaves the most genuine uncertainty, involves a second major earthquake in 551 AD, combined with what the archaeological and historical record suggests may have been a broader regional downturn tied to exactly the kind of climate and plague crisis explored earlier in this list. The aftermath of the late antique Little Ice Age and the arrival of the plague of Justinian, both of which struck the wider Eastern Roman world within the same general era Petra was already struggling through. By some point in the 6th or 7th centuries, sources on daily life in Petra grow sparse enough that historians can no longer confidently reconstruct the population, size, economic activity, or administrative status of the city with any precision. And by the time of the early Islamic conquests of the region in the 7th century, Petra appears to have already become a comparatively minor settlement, its great commercial network a matter of memory rather than active operation. The city was never fully abandoned in the way some ruins are. A small population persisted for centuries afterward, and Bedouin communities maintained connections to the site continuously into the modern era. But its role as one of the ancient world's essential commercial hubs had, by this point, entirely dissolved. What makes this decline a genuine mystery, rather than simply an unremarkable case of shifting trade patterns, is the unevenness of the evidence and the difficulty of weighing each contributing factor against the others with any real precision. Was it primarily economic, as maritime trade routes rendered centuries of hard-won desert expertise obsolete? Was it primarily environmental, as successive earthquakes struck at a water system with no margin for damage? Or was it primarily a matter of broader regional catastrophe? The same climatic and epidemiological crises reshaping societies from Britain to China, also quietly unraveling a kingdom that had once controlled the flow of incense and spice across an entire continent? Archaeological work at Petra continues, and each excavation season has, in recent decades, continued to refine and occasionally complicate this timeline. But a fully confident, single-cause answer remains elusive. What endures, regardless of the answer, is the city itself. The treasury, still standing at the end of its narrow gorge, the cistern still visible in the rock, evidence of an engineering sophistication that a purely nomadic people are not conventionally expected to have developed, sustained for 4 centuries in a place where survival alone should have been the primary challenge. How much of the Nabataeans' specific technical and commercial knowledge, their exact water-finding methods, their negotiated relationships with peoples across Arabia, the full extent of a network historians still cannot fully map, simply went silent with the kingdom's decline, absorbed and lost within the wider Roman and Byzantine world that replaced it. And what does it mean that a civilization capable of turning one of the harshest environments on Earth into the seat of an empire could, within a few centuries, become little more than a spectacular ruin, visited by travelers who no longer had any memory of who had built it or why? Where Petra's mystery is carved into visible sandstone, this next one is carved into something far more elusive: the record of the papacy itself, an institution that has tracked its own unbroken lineage back through nearly 2,000 years with an obsessive, almost bureaucratic precision. And somewhere in the middle of that otherwise continuous list, for several centuries of medieval retelling, a name appeared that should not have been possible at all. A female pope reigning in secret, exposed only by the one biological event no disguise could hide. The story, as it circulated widely by the 13th century, though earlier fragments appear before that, goes roughly like this. A woman, gifted with extraordinary intelligence, disguised herself as a man in order to pursue an education otherwise closed to her, eventually rising through the church's ranks under a male identity so convincingly that she was ultimately elected pope, reigning for a period most versions place in the 9th century, sometime between the historically documented papacies of Leo IV and Benedict III. Her reign, in the legend, ended in dramatic and public catastrophe. During a papal procession through the streets of Rome, she went into labor and gave birth in the street, her true identity and years of concealment exposed in the most physically undeniable way imaginable, in front of the very crowds who had, moments before, been paying her the reverence due to the Vicar of Christ. Some versions of the story end with her death on the spot, either from the birth itself or at the hands of an outraged mob. Others claim she was imprisoned for the remainder of her life. Taken purely as a story, it has all the ingredients of an enduring legend: deception, forbidden ambition, a scandal at the very peak of religious authority, and a public unmasking dramatic enough to function almost as a morality tale in itself. And for centuries, a great many people did take it as more than a story. The tale appears, with variations, in numerous medieval chronicles beginning in the 13th century, was widely repeated by both Catholic and later Protestant writers for different polemical purposes, and was treated as sufficiently plausible history that a bust or statue reportedly representing her was, according to some later accounts, included for a time among a series of papal likenesses in the Cathedral of Siena, before eventually being relabeled. By the time later scholars began seriously interrogating the claim, it had already accumulated the kind of institutional momentum that makes myths difficult to fully dislodge, regardless of the strength of the underlying evidence. And the underlying evidence, when examined closely, is genuinely thin. This is the central, defining fact of the Pope Joan case, and it separates this chapter from most of what we've explored so far in this list. There is no contemporary 9th century source, no chronicle, no letter, no administrative record from anywhere near the time she supposedly reigned, that mentions her existence. The papal timeline for this period is, by the standards of the early medieval world, reasonably well documented, with the reigns of Leo IV and Benedict III both recorded with specific dates that leave little to no plausible gap for an additional, several years long papacy to have occurred unnoticed and then been entirely scrubbed from every surviving contemporary record. The earliest known references to the Pope Joan's story do not appear until roughly 4 centuries after her supposed reign, emerging in chronicles written in the 13th century, a gap that, for historians, is itself close to disqualifying. A scandal of this magnitude, striking at the absolute center of the medieval church, existing in total documentary silence for 400 years before suddenly appearing in written form, is far more consistent with the pattern of a legend accumulating and eventually being written down than with a genuine historical event that somehow escaped record entirely during its own century. Given this, the overwhelming consensus among modern historians, including many working within Catholic institutions themselves, is that Pope Joan was almost certainly never a real reigning pope, that the story is a legend, likely originating from some combination of satire, moral allegory, or garbled half-memory of unrelated events, that was later mistaken for, or deliberately repackaged as, literal history. This is not a fringe position. It is the mainstream scholarly conclusion, and it's worth stating plainly rather than treating the legend's factual existence as a live, open question in the way we might treat, say, the missing eagle of the 18th Legion. So, where then does the actual mystery lie? Not, most historians would argue, in whether she existed, but in how and why a story with such thin foundations took hold so completely, and left physical traces that still puzzle visitors and scholars today. 2 specific pieces of evidence are most often cited by those looking for something more tangible behind the tale, and both are worth examining honestly, on their own terms, without either dismissing or overselling what they actually show. The first involves a specific route through Rome. For centuries, a persistent local tradition held that papal processions deliberately avoided a particular narrow street near the Colosseum, supposedly to bypass the exact location where Pope Joan had been exposed and given birth. Some later writers connected this alleged avoidance directly to the legend, treating it as a kind of inherited institutional embarrassment, quietly observed for generations. Whether papal processions genuinely avoided this specific route for this specific reason, however, is difficult to establish with confidence. Documentation for the practice comes primarily from later, legend-influenced sources rather than from any official record explaining the avoidance in the Church's own terms, and historians studying Roman processional routes have found more mundane logistical explanations related to the street's width and condition, at least as plausible as a deliberately encoded memorial to a scandal. The second, and more physically concrete piece of evidence involves an unusual object once used in early papal inauguration ceremonies: a chair, carved from marble or porphyry, known as the sedia stercoraria, featuring an open, keyhole-shaped seat. According to some later medieval and early modern accounts, this chair was used, at least for a period, as part of the ritual confirming a newly elected pope's identity, with some versions of the story claiming an examining official would physically verify the new pope's sex through the chair's opening before proceeding, sometimes framed with an accompanying, likely apocryphal declaration confirming him to be male. Such chairs do exist and can still be viewed in the Vatican museums today, originally believed by some scholars to have served an entirely different, more mundane function, potentially as ceremonial birthing or enthronement chairs adapted from earlier Roman imperial furniture, unrelated in original purpose to any test of sex at all. Whether any genuine ceremonial practice involving physical verification during papal inauguration ever actually occurred, and whether it predates or postdates the emergence of the Pope Joan legend, remains genuinely unclear, with historians divided on whether the chair inspired part of the myth, or whether the myth was retroactively used to explain an existing, and by then mysterious, piece of ceremonial furniture, whose original purpose had simply been forgotten. This is, in a sense, the real substance of the mystery. Not a hidden pope waiting to be confirmed by some undiscovered 9th century document, but a genuine, unresolved puzzle in the history of legend formation itself. Why did a story with essentially no 9th century evidentiary foundation nonetheless spread so widely, so persistently, and with such specific circumstantial detail? A name, a general time frame, an exact and vivid manner of exposure, that it was repeated as plausible fact by chroniclers, later included in certain semi-official lists of popes for a period, and physically commemorated, however ambiguously, in Roman ceremonial objects and processional tradition. Legends of this specificity and staying power don't typically emerge from nothing. Some historians have proposed the story may have grown from earlier, unrelated tales of female disguise and clerical scandals circulating in medieval Europe, gradually attaching themselves to the papacy, specifically because the idea of institutional hypocrisy at the very center of religious authority carried such potent symbolic and satirical weight, particularly for critics of the Church during periods of genuine internal scandal and corruption in later centuries. Others have wondered whether some kernel of an actual, far more minor incident, an impostor exposed, a scandal quickly suppressed and only half remembered, may have existed at some point in the Church's long and imperfectly documented history, and was later inflated, relocated, and attached retroactively to the 9th century as the story passed through generations of retelling. What remains, ultimately, is not a missing pope, but a missing origin, a legend so complete in its details that it fooled serious chroniclers, and, for a time, seemingly the Church's own ceremonial memory, and yet so absent from any contemporary 9th century source that its core claim cannot be sustained as history. Why did this particular story, out of the countless rumors and scandals that must have circulated in medieval Rome, achieve such extraordinary and specific staying power? And what does it say about how history itself is made, not always through what actually happened, but sometimes through what a later century needed to believe had happened? That a chair still sits in the Vatican museums today, its original purpose still not entirely settled, carrying the residue of a story most historians agree was never quite true. Where the story of Pope Joan turned out to rest on almost no contemporary foundation at all, this next mystery sits in a genuinely different category. A figure debated not because the evidence clearly says he didn't exist, but because the evidence from his supposed lifetime is so thin, so fragmentary, and so compromised by centuries of later embellishment that historians still cannot agree, even now, whether they are looking for a real man or chasing the shadow of one that later ages invented entirely. At Tintagel, on the rugged Cornish coast of southwestern England, the Atlantic beats against a headland where the ruins of a medieval castle still stand, exposed to wind and salt spray, connected to the mainland by a narrow, precarious bridge. Archaeological excavation here has uncovered something genuinely striking. Not just the well-known medieval castle, built centuries later, but evidence of a substantial, high-status settlement dating to the 5th and 6th centuries AD, the very period in which a historical King Arthur, if one existed, would have lived. Excavators have found fragments of fine imported pottery from the Mediterranean, evidence of trade connections stretching across a fractured post-Roman world, and, in 1998, a stone inscribed with Latin text that includes a name, Artonu, commissioning some kind of construction. The name is not Arthur. Most archaeologists and linguists are careful to note that Artonu and Arthur are not directly linguistically equivalent, and the stone almost certainly does not refer to a person later remembered as King Arthur. And yet the find, arriving at exactly the right site, from exactly the right century, close enough in name to invite speculation whether the scholarly consensus wanted it or not, captures something essential about the entire Arthur question. Tantalizing fragments, arriving from the right time and place, that never quite resolve into the certainty everyone is looking for. The core historical problem is this: the period in which a historical Arthur would have lived, roughly the late 5th to early 6th century AD, in the chaotic decades after Roman authority formally withdrew from Britain in 410, is one of the most poorly documented stretches in the entire history of the British Isles. Roman administrative record-keeping, along with it, largely ceased. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles that would later document English history hadn't yet begun. What survives from this specific window is desperately sparse, and the few sources that do address it were mostly written well after the fact, by authors working from oral tradition, earlier lost texts, or their own reconstructive imagination, rather than from anything approaching a contemporary record. The earliest text that mentions a figure resembling Arthur is a Latin work called the Historia Brittonum, traditionally attributed to a Welsh monk named Nennius, and generally dated to around 828 AD, over 3 centuries after Arthur would have lived. It describes a military leader named Arthur, notably not called a king in this earliest account, who is credited with leading British forces to victory in 12 battles against invading Anglo-Saxons, culminating in a decisive engagement at a place called Mons Badonicus, or Baden Hill. Crucially, an earlier source, a 6th century British monk named Gildas, writing a polemical work called On the Ruin of Britain, does independently describe a real historical battle at Baden Hill as a significant British victory against Saxon incursion, placing it, based on Gildas's own account, within his own lifetime or shortly before it. This is, for historians searching for any kernel of authenticity in the Arthur legend, the single most important piece of corroborating evidence available. A documented, broadly contemporary battle that later tradition explicitly connects to Arthur. The problem is that Gildas, our earliest and closest source, does not mention Arthur by name at all. He describes the battle. He does not name its commander. The connection between Arthur and Baden Hill comes only from Nennius, writing centuries later, leaving historians to weigh a real, independently attested victory against a much later attribution of leadership that cannot be independently verified. From this thin foundation, later medieval writers built an enormous edifice. The 12th century cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his Historia Regum Britannia, transformed the sparse battle leader Arthur of Nennius into a full royal biography, complete with a court, a father named Uther Pendragon, a wizard advisor, and a narrative arc stretching from miraculous conception to eventual death, presented with a confident, detailed narrative voice that gave every impression of established historical fact, despite drawing, by Geoffrey's own admission and by most modern scholarly assessment, heavily on his own invention alongside whatever fragments of earlier Welsh and Breton oral tradition he had access to. It was this version, essentially a work of medieval historical fiction dressed convincingly as chronicle, that provided the foundation for the version of Arthur that would dominate for the next 1,000 years, later expanded by French and English writers across the medieval period into the version most familiar today, complete with Camelot, the Round Table, Lancelot, the Holy Grail, and Excalibur, almost none of which appears anywhere in the earliest, sparsest sources, and most of which modern historians treat as later literary invention layered onto, and eventually burying, whatever more modest historical kernel may once have existed. This layering is precisely what makes the historical question so difficult to answer cleanly. Modern historians studying the period broadly fall into several camps, and it's worth noting that none of these positions is fringe in the way some theories in this list have been. This is genuine active mainstream scholarly disagreement, conducted by serious historians working with the same limited evidence and reaching different defensible conclusions. Some scholars argue that a real historical figure, very likely not a king in any formal sense, but a successful British military commander operating during the genuinely chaotic decades of Anglo-Saxon invasion, probably did exist, and that his real, more modest achievements were gradually mythologized, exaggerated, and eventually merged with older Celtic legendary and folkloric material over the centuries of oral transmission before Nennius finally set a version down in writing. This position treats the Baden Hill victory as a real, anchoring event, with Arthur functioning as the name later tradition attached to whoever actually led it. Other historians take a considerably more skeptical position, arguing that the near-total absence of Arthur's name from any source genuinely contemporary with the events described, including Gildas, who would have had every reason to name a celebrated British commander responsible for one of the period's few real victories, if that commander were widely known by that name in his own lifetime, suggests Arthur may be an entirely later construction, a legendary or folkloric figure retroactively inserted into a real, historical battle by writers centuries removed from the actual events, rather than a real individual whose memory simply became exaggerated over time. Adding to the difficulty, archaeology, for all its advances, has never produced anything that unambiguously resolves the question either way. Numerous sites across Britain, from Cadbury Castle in Somerset to Tintagel itself, have been proposed over the centuries as candidates for a real Camelot or a genuine Arthurian stronghold, and excavations at several of these sites, including Cadbury, have indeed revealed impressive, high-status fortifications dating to the correct general period, confirming that substantial, well-organized British power centers did exist in exactly the chaotic post-Roman decades the Arthur legend describes. What none of these excavations have produced, at any site, is a direct, unambiguous inscription or artifact naming a leader as Arthur in a context that securely ties him to the events later tradition describes. The Tintagel stone remains the closest and most tantalizing near miss the archaeological record has yet offered, and even that, as we've noted, is generally regarded as a case of a similar-sounding name rather than genuine confirmation. What we're left with, then, is not a figure whose historical existence has been disproven, in the way modern scholarship has largely dismissed the literal historicity of Pope Joan, but something arguably more unsettled. A genuine, unresolved historical question, kept permanently ambiguous by the specific, unlucky accident of exactly when in Britain's history he supposedly lived. A window so thin on contemporary record-keeping that even a real, significant military leader could plausibly pass through it, leaving almost no direct documentary trace, indistinguishable in the historical record from a legend that never had a single real person behind it at all. Was there a real man, a battle-hardened commander of the sub-Roman British holding a fracturing frontier against Anglo-Saxon invasion, whose genuine victory at Baden Hill was real enough to survive independently in Gildas's account, even as his own name was lost or never widely recorded to begin with? Or is Arthur, in the end, a name that later centuries needed, attached after the fact to a real battle that badly wanted a hero, and then built outward for 1,000 years into the version we know today, Camelot, the Round Table and all, until the truth beneath it became permanently, perhaps deliberately, unrecoverable, somewhere in the gap between Gildas's unnamed victor and Nennius's named battle leader 3 centuries apart. The real answer, if one still exists at all, remains lost. A legend once traveled with the earliest European visitors to southern Africa, a story of a lost city built by King Solomon, or perhaps the Queen of Sheba, its walls too sophisticated, too impressive to have possibly been raised by African hands. That legend was wrong, and thoroughly disproven by modern archaeology. But the true story it obscured for so long is, in its own way, just as compelling, and considerably less settled than the myth it replaced. The stone walls of Great Zimbabwe rise from the hills of the Zimbabwean plateau in curving, mortarless courses, fitted together with a precision that has withstood roughly 6 centuries of weather without collapsing. The largest structure, known today as the Great Enclosure, forms a wall over 30 feet high and 800 feet in circumference, built entirely from granite blocks shaped and stacked without any binding mortar at all. An engineering achievement that required not just labor, but an intimate, generations-deep understanding of the local stone and its properties. At its height, likely sometime between the 13th and 15th centuries AD, Great Zimbabwe was the political and economic center of a substantial regional kingdom, home to an estimated population of up to 18,000 people, and the hub of a trade network stretching outward to the Swahili coast, and, from there, across the Indian Ocean. Archaeologists have recovered Chinese porcelain, Persian pottery, and glass beads from the Middle East within the site, physical evidence of just how far the kingdom's commercial reach extended. And then, sometime around the 15th century, the city that had stood as the center of that world for generations was abandoned. Not destroyed, not conquered, as far as any archaeological evidence indicates. Simply, and rather quietly, left. What makes Great Zimbabwe's story part of a genuinely larger and more layered mystery, though, is what came before it, and what has become increasingly clear through decades of more recent archaeological work across the wider region. Great Zimbabwe was not an isolated achievement, springing up without precedent. It was the culmination of a much longer tradition of stone-walled settlements across the southern African plateau, a tradition that begins, based on current evidence, with smaller, earlier capitals like Mapungubwe, located near the confluence of the Limpopo and Shashe rivers, which flourished from roughly the 11th through the 13th centuries before it, too, was abandoned, seemingly in favor of the rising power at Great Zimbabwe itself. This pattern, a capital rising, flourishing for a century or two, drawing trade and population and political authority toward itself, and then being abandoned as a new center rises elsewhere on the plateau, repeats itself multiple times across several centuries, continuing even after Great Zimbabwe's own decline, with the later capitals such as Kemi emerging to inherit at least part of its role in the region's trade and political life. It's this recurring cycle, more than any single abandonment in isolation, that has puzzled and intrigued researchers. Why did this civilization repeatedly build extraordinary permanent stone capitals, only to walk away from each one after a few generations, seemingly by choice rather than through catastrophe? The most widely supported explanation, developed through decades of archaeological and environmental research, centers on resource exhaustion, though not in any single, simple sense. A population in the tens of thousands, concentrated at Great Zimbabwe's peak, would have placed enormous cumulative strain on the surrounding environment. Cattle, central to both the kingdom's economy and its social and political status system, require extensive grazing land, and sustained grazing at this scale, concentrated in one region for generations, can degrade pasture land over time, particularly as herds grow to reflect and display the accumulated wealth of a prospering elite. Similarly, the population's fuel needs, for cooking, for iron smelting, an industry Great Zimbabwe is known to have practiced at meaningful scale, would have required substantial and sustained wood harvesting from the surrounding landscape, gradually depleting local forest cover in a region that, as savanna and semi-arid plateau, does not regenerate its woodland quickly. Over a century or more of concentrated habitation, this combination of grazing pressure and deforestation could plausibly have degraded the immediate environment around Great Zimbabwe enough to make continued support of a population this large increasingly difficult. encouraging a gradual dispersal rather than a single dramatic exodus. Climate has also entered this picture, particularly in more recent research. Paleoclimate reconstructions for southern Africa during the relevant centuries suggest the region may have experienced shifts in rainfall patterns during the period of Great Zimbabwe's decline, potentially including drier conditions that would have compounded the environmental stress already caused by grazing and deforestation, straining the kingdom's ability to sustain both its population and its cattle wealth simultaneously. This kind of climate-linked strain, layered on top of resource pressures already building from within, offers a coherent and, in broad strokes, reasonably well-supported picture. Not a single crisis, but an accumulating one, in which environmental degradation, driven by the very success and scale the kingdom had achieved, gradually made the capital's location less viable, prompting political and economic authority to relocate elsewhere on the plateau, toward fresher land and, quite possibly, renewed access to trade routes whose importance may have been shifting over time as well. And yet, as with several of the mysteries already explored in this list, an explanation that is broadly plausible in outline is not the same as one confirmed in detail, and Great Zimbabwe's abandonment retains real elements of genuine uncertainty. The precise timeline of decline is not fully settled. While most researchers place the primary period of abandonment somewhere in the 15th century, the process of decline appears to have unfolded gradually, rather than through any single, datable event, with some peripheral activity potentially continuing at reduced scale, even as the site's political centrality faded, making it difficult to say with confidence exactly when, or how quickly, the transition from capital to relatively empty ruin actually occurred. Nor is it entirely clear how directly the shift in regional power to later capitals like Kami should be read as cause or consequence of Great Zimbabwe's decline, rather than a separate coinciding development. Did the kingdom's elite relocate deliberately in an organized transition of political authority to a new, better resourced capital? Or did Great Zimbabwe's decline unfold more chaotically, its unified political structure fragmenting as environmental and economic pressures mounted, with successor states like Kami emerging afterward from the resulting competition rather than through any coordinated succession? There is also the question of trade itself, and how much its shifting patterns contributed independently to the decline, separate from purely environmental pressure. Great Zimbabwe's wealth depended heavily on its role connecting inland gold and ivory production to the Swahili coast and the wider Indian Ocean trading world. Some researchers have proposed that changes in the structure or routes of that trade network during the relevant centuries, potentially connected to broader shifts happening within the Swahili coastal city-states themselves during this period, may have reduced Great Zimbabwe's specific commercial advantage, encouraging political and economic reorganization around new centers better positioned to capture whatever trade relationships remained most valuable. This explanation, while plausible, is harder to test directly than the environmental evidence, since it depends on reconstructing trade dynamics across an enormous and only partially documented Indian Ocean network, rather than reading degradation directly from soil, pollen, and faunal remains at the site itself. Beyond these more grounded, evidence-based explanations, the site's dramatic scale and its complicated colonial-era history, during which European visitors and, later, the white minority government of Rhodesia actively suppressed and denied its African origins for political reasons, insisting for decades on foreign builders despite mounting archaeological evidence to the contrary, have left behind a longer shadow of speculation than the evidence alone might otherwise generate. Most of the wilder theories once attached to Great Zimbabwe's origins have been thoroughly and definitively put to rest by modern archaeology, which has established beyond serious scholarly doubt that the site was built, occupied, and eventually abandoned entirely by the ancestors of the Shona people indigenous to the region. What remains genuinely open is not who built it, but the finer mechanics of why, after centuries of success, its builders and their successors kept choosing to walk away from what they had built, again and again, across successive generations and successive capitals. Today, the walls of Great Zimbabwe still stand largely as they were left, their granite blocks holding their curved formations without a trace of mortar, exactly as they have for roughly 600 years. Was the abandonment, in the end, simply the practical, adaptive response of a sophisticated society that understood the limits of its own land, choosing renewal elsewhere over decline in place? Or does the repeating pattern across the plateau, Mapungubwe, then Great Zimbabwe, then Kami, each rising, flourishing, and giving way to the next, point toward some deeper, still poorly understood rhythm in how this civilization organized and reorganized its power across the land, one that current archaeology has only begun to map and outline? The stones remain. The precise reasoning of the people who last walked away from them does not. On a hillside above the city of Cusco, in the Peruvian Andes, sits a wall built from stones so massive, so precisely fitted, and so improbably shaped that visitors have spent nearly 5 centuries trying to reconcile what they're looking at with what they're told about how it was made. The site is Saksaywaman, a monumental complex constructed by the Inca, whose zigzagging terrace walls climb the hill above Cusco in 3 tiered rows of megalithic stonework. Some of the individual blocks used in its construction weigh well over 100 tons, with the largest estimated at closer to 200 tons, comparable in scale to some of the heaviest stones used in ancient Egyptian construction, but shaped here not into simple rectangular blocks, but into complex, irregular polygonal forms, each stone cut with multiple angled faces that interlock with its neighbors so tightly that famously a blade cannot be inserted into the seams between them. No mortar holds these walls together. None was needed. The stones were shaped, individually, to fit the exact and specific contours of the ones beside them, a technique requiring not just enormous labor to move and lift blocks of this size, but an extraordinary, almost bespoke level of precision in the shaping of each individual piece, since no single stone in the wall is identical to another, and each was evidently custom-fitted to its unique neighbors rather than cut to a standardized, repeatable form. The mainstream historical and archaeological account of how and why Saksaywaman was built rests on reasonably solid documentary and physical ground, at least in its broad outlines. The site was constructed by the Inca Empire, most likely beginning during the reign of the Emperor Pachacuti in the mid-15th century and continuing under his successors, as part of a broader Inca building program that transformed Cusco into an imperial capital, reflecting the Incas' rapidly expanding power across the Andes. Spanish chroniclers, arriving in the 16th century during and after the conquest, recorded testimony from Inca informants describing the site's construction, including accounts suggesting that tens of thousands of laborers were mobilized for the project, organized through the Inca Mita system, a form of rotational labor tribute that Inca subjects across the empire were obligated to provide to the state, typically for state construction and agricultural projects. Quarries in the surrounding region have been identified, containing partially worked stone and evidence of ancient extraction techniques, and some archaeologists have documented what appear to be ancient roads or ramps in the surrounding terrain, plausibly used to transport blocks from quarry to construction site. In broad strokes, then, the how of Saksaywaman is not entirely mysterious. A powerful, highly organized imperial state, capable of mobilizing enormous coordinated labor forces, applying stoneworking techniques refined over generations of Andean construction to build a monument befitting its capital. But broad strokes are not the same as a fully resolved picture, and it is in the specific mechanical details, the how exactly rather than the how in general, that Saksaywaman continues to generate real scholarly debate rather than settled consensus. The Inca did not have iron or steel tools. Their stoneworking technology relied primarily on harder stone hammers and abrasive techniques, along with, evidence suggests, a considerable amount of patient pounding, grinding, and polishing rather than any cutting implement in the modern sense, reproducing the kind of precise, multi-angled, interlocking joinery found at Saksaywaman using only these tools at the scale and volume the site required, remains a genuinely difficult engineering problem to fully explain through experimental archaeology. And researchers who have attempted to replicate Inca stoneworking techniques on smaller test blocks have generally been able to demonstrate the plausibility of the methods in principle, without fully resolving how such precision was achieved efficiently enough and consistently enough to explain a structure of Saksaywaman's total scale within the known, relatively compressed time frame of Inca imperial construction. The question of how such enormous blocks were actually transported and maneuvered into their final positions carries a similar mix of documented plausibility and lingering technical uncertainty. Spanish colonial accounts describe labor forces using ropes, log rollers, and earthen ramps to move and position massive stones, methods broadly consistent with what other pre-industrial societies elsewhere in the world are documented as having used to move comparably massive stones. And yet, no single, fully detailed contemporary account describes step by step precisely how the largest blocks at Saksaywaman specifically were quarried, transported down from their source, and then hoisted and rotated into their final, precisely interlocking positions on the hillside, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct the most difficult and physically demanding parts of the process through inference and comparative analogy rather than direct documentary confirmation. It's within this specific gap, the difference between knowing broadly who built Saksaywaman and why, versus fully and confidently reconstructing exactly how its most extreme technical achievements were accomplished, that more speculative theories have found room to grow. Some researchers and enthusiasts outside mainstream archaeology have proposed that the most technically demanding elements of Inca stonework, including Saksaywaman's largest and most precisely fitted blocks, may reflect construction techniques, tools, or organizational capabilities not fully captured or explained by the Spanish colonial record, given how compressed, biased by conquest-era political agendas, and dependent on second-hand translation those accounts often are. Others have gone considerably further, suggesting the site's most impressive stonework may predate the Inca entirely, potentially originating with an earlier, less understood Andean culture, whose techniques the Inca later inherited, adapted, or simply built directly upon. This idea, sometimes called a pre-Inca construction theory for certain megalithic sites in the region, remains a genuine minority position within serious archaeological discussion, generally not well supported by the current dating and stratigraphic evidence at Saksaywaman specifically, though it has found more traction and slightly more scholarly consideration at other regional sites with more ambiguous construction histories. At the far edge of speculation, a small number of outside theorists have proposed that the extreme precision on display could not have been achieved through any purely manual stoneworking process at all, invoking either lost, more advanced ancient technology or, in the most extreme and least evidentially supported versions, external assistance entirely outside the historical Andean cultural context. Mainstream archaeologists overwhelmingly reject these more extreme framings, pointing to the substantial and growing body of evidence for sophisticated indigenous Andean engineering knowledge, including comparable if generally smaller scale, precision stonework found at multiple other Inca and pre-Inca sites throughout the region, suggesting a genuine, locally developed tradition of technical mastery refined over centuries, rather than an isolated, inexplicable anomaly. What makes this genuinely a live area of ongoing archaeological inquiry, rather than settled history awaiting only public acceptance, is that even researchers firmly within the mainstream consensus, who confidently and correctly attribute Saksaywaman to the Inca and their documented labor and construction systems, continue to actively debate the finer mechanical details of the achievement itself. How, precisely, were stones weighing well over 100 tons maneuvered with enough control to achieve joint tolerances fine enough to exclude a knife blade, using only stone tools, rope, and human muscle, without the aid of iron implements, load-bearing arches, or draft animals capable of hauling weight at this scale? Experimental archaeology has made real, credible progress in recent decades toward demonstrating plausible methods for smaller-scale Inca stonework, but has not yet produced a fully conclusive, comprehensive reconstruction, addressing every aspect of Saksaywaman's most extreme examples specifically. This is not a gap that requires abandoning the well-supported historical framework of Inca construction to explain. It is, instead, a genuinely open engineering and archaeological question sitting comfortably within that framework. The kind of unresolved technical detail that continued excavation, continued experimental replication, and continued study of surviving quarry sites may yet fully close, even if it hasn't been fully closed today. The walls of Saksaywaman remain exactly where they were placed roughly 5.5 centuries ago, their seams still too fine for a blade, their largest stones still resting in positions that took, by any honest account, an extraordinary combination of labor, organization, and technical skill to achieve. Was this precision purely the product of patient, iterative craftsmanship, refined over generations of Andean stoneworking tradition and scaled up dramatically for an emperor's capital? Or does some portion of the specific method, the exact sequence of quarrying, shaping, transporting, and fitting stones of this scale with this degree of accuracy, remain incompletely understood, waiting for the right combination of experimental archaeology and newly examined quarry evidence to finally close the gap between what we know the Inca accomplished and how, in every technical detail, they actually accomplished it? Somewhere beneath the sands of the southern Arabian Peninsula, in territory that has never been fully excavated and remains, even today, only partially accessible to archaeologists, lie the answers to what happened to one of Rome's most ambitious and least successful military expeditions, a campaign so poorly documented in its final details that historians still cannot say with confidence how many men Rome lost, or precisely where the survivors, if there were any, finally turned back. The expedition took place in 26 or 25 BC, early in the reign of Augustus, and its objective was audacious even by the standards of an empire that rarely thought small: the conquest, or at least the subjugation of Arabia Felix, the fertile southern region of the Arabian Peninsula, corresponding roughly to modern Yemen, a region legendary throughout the ancient Mediterranean world as the source of frankincense, myrrh, and other aromatic goods so valuable that Roman writers routinely described the region's wealth in almost mythical terms. The expedition was led by Aelius Gallus, the Roman prefect of Egypt, acting under direct orders from Augustus, and our primary account of what happened comes from the geographer Strabo, who knew Gallus personally and drew on his first-hand testimony, making this, in principle, one of the better-sourced Roman military disasters in terms of proximity to an actual participant. And yet, despite that proximity, the account we have leaves enormous, consequential gaps. According to Strabo, Gallus assembled a substantial force, generally estimated at around 10,000 troops, drawn from Roman legionary detachments in Egypt along with allied Nabataean and Jewish auxiliary forces, and set out from the Red Sea coast intending to march south into Arabia Felix, subdue the region, and secure its lucrative trade routes and resources directly under Roman control. From the outset, the campaign was plagued by problems that Strabo attributes substantially to poor guidance, describing the expedition's Nabataean guide, a man named Silius, in terms suggesting either outright treachery or catastrophic incompetence, claiming Silius deliberately led the Roman force along excessively long, difficult, and poorly resourced routes, through terrain lacking adequate water and provisions that a more direct or better planned route could plausibly have avoided. Whether Silius's actions reflected genuine sabotage aimed at protecting Nabataean commercial interests in a trade network Rome's success in Arabia would have directly threatened, or simply reflect a later, self-serving Roman narrative constructed by Gallus and his allies to explain an expedition that had failed for other, more embarrassing reasons, is itself a question the surviving evidence cannot fully settle. What is clear, even through Strabo's account, is that the expedition suffered catastrophically, and not primarily from combat. The Roman force reportedly took around 6 months simply to reach the vicinity of Marib, the capital of the Sabaean kingdom in what is now Yemen, worn down over that time far more by disease, exhaustion, and the punishing environmental conditions of the Arabian interior than by any organized military resistance. Strabo describes the Roman army as having engaged in relatively little actual fighting throughout the campaign, with its losses coming instead from what he characterizes as hunger, fatigue, bad water, and illness contracted along the march. After reaching the area around Marib, and following what appears to have been a limited and ultimately unsuccessful siege or engagement there, Gallus made the decision to abandon the campaign and turn back, leading the surviving remnant of his force on a considerably faster return march, reportedly completed in a matter of weeks rather than the many months the outbound journey had required, suggesting either a far more direct return route, a desperate forced march, or, quite possibly, both. And here the documented record simply thins out to almost nothing. Strabo does not provide a clear, specific casualty count for the expedition as a whole. He does report, in a passage historians still debate the precise implications of, that very few of the original force survived to return, though exactly how many men that vague phrasing represents, out of an expedition generally estimated at around 10,000, is left entirely to inference. No detailed Roman military accounting of the expedition's losses survives, if such an accounting was ever formally compiled at all. No archaeological evidence directly tied to the expedition's route, encampments, or losses has been definitively identified anywhere along the presumed path through the Arabian interior, despite the campaign's scale and its documented objective of reaching a specific, identifiable city. For a disaster resulting in the death of what may have been several thousand Roman and allied troops in a single sustained campaign under direct imperial orders, the near-total absence of physical, on-the-ground archaeological confirmation is a genuinely significant gap, distinguishing this case from more thoroughly documented Roman defeats like Teutoburg, where the battlefield itself, once located, yielded extensive physical corroboration of the ancient written accounts. The most straightforward, mainstream explanation for this archaeological silence is largely practical rather than mysterious in any deeper sense. The interior of the southern Arabian Peninsula, then and now, is an extraordinarily difficult environment for archaeological survey, combining harsh desert terrain, historically limited infrastructure for large-scale excavation, and, particularly in recent decades, significant political instability and restricted access across much of Yemen specifically, where ongoing conflict has made systematic, sustained archaeological work in many relevant regions difficult or simply impossible for extended periods. Under this explanation, the physical evidence of Gallus's failed campaign may well exist, scattered somewhere along a route archaeologists have not yet been able to properly survey, rather than having been erased or hidden through any more deliberate process. This is broadly comparable, in its underlying logic, to the situation with the missing Roman eagle from Teutoburg's 18th Legion, or, for that matter, the still unlocated tomb of Alaric. Cases where a lack of confirming discovery reflects the practical limits of where and how thoroughly the ground has actually been searched, rather than any inherent impossibility of the physical evidence existing at all. Still, the specific combination of factors in the alias Gallus case has left room for more pointed questions that the practical explanation alone doesn't fully resolve. Why, precisely, did Strabo, writing with direct access to Gallus himself, a man who presumably had every reason to want an accurate account of his own campaign's losses recorded, whatever the political embarrassment involved, leave the expedition's actual casualty figures so vague? Some historians have proposed this vagueness may itself be telling, suggesting either that Gallus was reluctant to have the true scale of the disaster formally recorded, given the potential political and career consequences of presiding over the near-total destruction of a substantial Roman force during a high-profile campaign personally ordered by Augustus, or that Strabo, despite his personal connection to Gallus, was working from an account that was itself already selectively incomplete by the time it reached him. Rome's broader historical pattern, as we've already seen with Stilicho's finances and the missing legionary eagles, was not one of uniformly meticulous record-keeping, regardless of political convenience. Embarrassing losses, particularly ones resulting more from poor planning and environmental miscalculation than from any credit-worthy defeat at the hands of a formidable enemy, seem to have been genuinely susceptible to being recorded thinly, vaguely, or selectively, when a fuller accounting served no one's immediate political interest. There is also a further, more specific question surrounding Silius, the Nabataean guide blamed by Strabo for the expedition's hardships. Silius was, some years after the Arabian campaign, tried and executed in Rome on charges that included, among other accusations, deliberately sabotaging Gallus's expedition. Whether this later trial reflects a genuine, substantiated case of deliberate treachery, uncovered through evidence beyond Gallus's own account, or whether Silius became a convenient scapegoat for a campaign whose true failures lay primarily in Roman planning, logistics, and unfamiliarity with the specific demands of desert campaigning, is a question historians continue to weigh without full resolution, given how directly Gallus and his allies stood to benefit from having someone else to blame. What remains, nearly 2,000 years later, is an expedition whose broad outline is documented by a source with genuine, direct access to a first-hand participant, and yet whose most consequential details, how many men actually died, exactly where the worst of the losses occurred along an interior route no archaeologist has yet been able to fully trace, and how much of the disaster was genuinely attributable to betrayal versus miscalculation, remain unresolved, buried somewhere between Strabo's deliberately vague phrasing and a landscape that has, for both practical and political reasons across 2,000 years, never been fully searched. Did thousands of Roman and Allied soldiers die along a route through the Arabian interior that still holds their remains and equipment, waiting for an era of political stability and archaeological access that has not yet arrived? Or has time, sand, and 2 millennia of a shifting desert environment already erased whatever physical trace the expedition once left behind, leaving Strabo's vague second-hand account as the only record we will ever have of exactly how badly Rome's ambitions in Arabia truly failed.